guys, welcome to another science lesson with HK Math and Science. This video will be about atoms, and by the end of this lesson we should all know the difference between elements, compounds and molecules, know the different subatomic particles and how they are arranged inside the atom, and finally be able to define the terms ions, cations and anions. Let's just pause the video here and take a couple of minutes to write these down. So let's just start off with a quick recap. So we should all know that all substances are made of atoms. And these atoms are very tiny particles, and many substances are made up of different types of atoms. Example is water. Water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. This bucket to the right here will be made up of carbon and hydrogen atoms. This car here will be made up of iron, aluminium, silicon, oxygen and boron atoms. And finally this flower here will be made up of carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen and sulfur atoms. So the key point from this slide is that all substances are made up of very tiny particles called atoms, and many substances are made up of different types of atoms. Remembering our keywords from our first success criteria was elements, compounds and molecules. Let's start off with elements here. So an element is a substance made up of only one type of atom. So I have a couple of examples here. This bucket on the left, this one's made up of only copper atoms. So copper is an element made up of copper atoms only. Next we have carbon in the middle. Carbon is made up of carbon atoms only. And finally on the right here we have these balloons filled up with helium, and helium is an element made up of only helium atoms. So key point here is that an element is a substance made up of only one type of atom. So on the left only copper, middle only carbon, and on the right only helium. Our next key word was compound. So if a substance is made up of different atoms, then it is known as a compound. So once again, I've got an example of an element on the left. This one's made up of only oxygen. However, on the right here, I have water. It's made up of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. So this one will be a compound. And finally, our last one was molecules. So atoms can combine with other atoms to form molecules. So having a look on the top right here, these two red circles will be both oxygen atoms. So we have two red circles, so that makes O2 because there's two oxygens giving us the molecule O2 or oxygen. Key note here, this is not a compound, and that's because it's made up of only one atom. However, right below here, water is a molecule made up of both oxygen and hydrogen atoms. So this one is also a compound as well. So it's a molecule and a compound. Oxygen will be just a molecule, water will be a molecule and a compound. Alright, so hopefully you guys know the three keywords here: molecules, compound and elements. And let's move on to the next part. We're going inside the atom now. So atoms are really small, but atoms are made up of even smaller particles known as subatomic particles. You may have heard of this word before, but the three subatomic particles in atoms are protons, neutrons and electrons. So if you have a look on the right here, if you got a really strong microscope, this is what you would see inside an atom. So the nucleus is in the middle. It contains the neutron and the protons, and on the outside orbiting the nucleus we have the electrons, and all together that makes our atom. Now let's have a look at some of the properties of the subatomic particles. So if you have a look at this table, it's got the subatomic particle on the left, location on the second column, so proton, neutron in the nucleus and electron in the electron cloud around the nucleus. And then we have the mass. If you have a look at that, we can see that proton and neutrons, they're 1,800 times heavier than the electron. And protons, this is another key point, protons have a positive charge, neutrons have no charge, and electrons have a negative charge. So protons and neutrons are similar in mass, and electrons are much lighter than protons, as you can see here. And in an atom, the number of electrons equals the number of protons. Because remember, proton has a positive charge, and the electron has a negative charge. We need to have the same number of them for it to cancel out. So the negative charge of the electrons balances the positive charge of the protons. Alright, now looking at the periodic table a little bit, we have the atomic number and the mass number. So atomic number is the number of protons in an atom, and the number of protons in the nucleus determines the type of atom it is and what element it belongs to. On the periodic table, this will be the number above it, just right there. So hydrogen will have an atomic number of 1. Lithium would have an atomic number of 3, and magnesium would have an atomic number of 12. The number below it is known as the mass number, and the mass number is the number of protons plus neutrons in an atom. So overall, it's the mass of the atom, and remember the majority of the mass is in the protons and the neutrons, so we can get the mass number of an atom by adding the protons and neutrons. And at this point you might be thinking, why don't we add the electrons as well? Because they are also part of the atom. But we don't add it because they are so light. They're 1,800 times lighter than both the proton and the neutron. They're so light that their weight is negligible, so it won't make much of a difference. So scientists actually don't include the electron in the mass number. The number of neutrons does not affect which element the atom belongs to, but does affect the atom's mass. Alright, so just a couple of more key points here. In this is sodium, Na is sodium. The number of protons is the atomic number. On a periodic table, the atomic number is normally up the top, but in this case, they've written it below. So for this one here, the number of protons in sodium is the atomic number, so it's 11. So there are 11 protons in the nucleus. Remember, the number of electrons is also equal to the number of protons, so we also know that there are 11 electrons orbiting the nucleus. And the number of neutrons is the mass number minus the atomic number. So we have 23 minus 11 because we know that the mass number is 23 and we know there's 11 protons. So we're going to have 12 neutrons in the nucleus. So from just the two numbers on the periodic table, the atomic number and the mass number, we can get the number of protons, the number of electrons, and the number of neutrons. Alright, now let's move on to the last section of this lesson. The last topic is about ions. Atoms can lose or gain electrons to become electronically charged particles called ions. You have that definition down, that's going to be pretty important. And also there's two types of ions. The first one is known as a cation, and the second is known as the anion. It's not the cation or the anion, it's cation and anion, remember that. So in a cation, an atom loses electrons, so it now has more protons than electrons. Have a look on the top right here, this is the normal atom here. It's going to lose an electron, notice there's one less here. So now it has a positive charge. You can see there's 3 positives and 2 negatives. So there's one more positive, so the charge will be +1 here. And on the bottom we have anions. Anions are just pretty much the opposite of a cation. So in an anion, the atom gains an electron and it now has more electrons than protons. So have a look on the right here, we started off with 3 electrons and now we have 4. So that means we have 4 negative charges and 3 positive charges. If you can do the math, that will give us -1. So in this case, this one has a charge of -1. So in summary, cations have a positive charge because they've lost an electron, and anions have a negative charge because they've gained an electron. It's always the movement of electrons. And just to elaborate a little bit further, the symbol for an ion is the same as the chemical symbol for the atom, but with the charge of the ion added to it. So the cation version of sodium, in which sodium atom has lost 1 electron and has a charge of +1, it will just be written as Na+. And magnesium, a magnesium atom that has lost 2 electrons, which has a charge of +2, will be written as Mg2+. If we went the other way though, so that if magnesium gained 2 electrons, let's say gained, that means it's going to have a negative charge. We start with Mg. If it's got a charge of -2, it's going to be written as Mg2-. So in short, the chemical symbol stays the same and we just write the charge on the top right. Alright, so that brings us to the end of this video. Hopefully you guys do have a better understanding of atoms at this point, and that you guys know the difference between elements, compounds, and molecules, know the different subatomic particles and how they're arranged inside the atom, and finally can define the terms ions, cations, and anions. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys all back online.